I'm going to read just a little bit of your bio and I'll paraphrase some of it. But Dr. Eric P. Mandat, a clarinetist and composer, he's been doing this for nearly 40 years and has been at the forefront of clarinet extended performance techniques exploration, particularly multiphonics, microtones, and timbral modulations, which we're going to learn about today. Through his work with these extended techniques, Eric has developed a deeply personal artistic expression as a performer and composer, and he is recognized worldwide as one of the foremost authorities on clarinet extended techniques. And I highly recommend you go check out his bio and all of his recordings, but he also enjoys an extremely diverse performance career as both a soloist and a chamber musician, and has a chamber music festival, a new music festival, and has received numerous honors and awards for his work as a performer and as a composer. He has taught at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale since 1981, where he is currently visiting professor of clarinet and distinguished scholar. Eric was the recipient of the 1999 Southern Illinois University Outstanding Scholar Award, the university's highest honor for research and creative work. He is a dedicated and in-demand teacher. Eric has presented recitals, masterclasses, and lectures on extended performance techniques at more than 120 conservatories and universities around the world. And he regularly appears as guest artist at clarinet-specific events throughout the United States. And just on a personal note, and I don't know if I've ever told you this, but I've always been drawn to the weird and the outlandish. And so you were always a hero of mine because I knew that I could play all that weird stuff. And now my students are like, oh, she's playing more weird stuff. So I really appreciate your work personally. It was very liberating for me as a player. And we're just so happy to have you. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about my background, how I got into this, and mostly it pretty much started from the very beginning. You know, I got the clarinet in 4th grade, and I learned how to put it together, and the band director said, okay, no fingers, it's an open G, and so I went, the band director said, well, no, that's not right. And so he showed me how to do it, and I got it right. I learned all those notes on the fundamental register. Then I started climbing up into the clarion register, and that was okay for a while until I got to the higher notes. And I got that. Band director said, oh, that's not right. And so showed me how to help not grunt those notes. But what I did, those first 2 moments of wrong playing were my first multiphonics. And so while most of us spend like the rest of our playing careers trying to avoid those first 2 mistakes that we do, I've spent most of my time exploring and trying to see what's behind all those mistakes. I was a great squeaker growing up, and so I had a lot of chance to practice and figure out what the heck I was doing and why. And then when I got to college, I started, I learned a lot more music that I never knew before. And I finally learned that there were these things called multiphonics. I had seen a couple of pieces that included them, and I actually saw one of the only books that was out there on that included clarinet multiphonics. At that time, it was Bruno Bartolozzi's New Sounds for Woodwind, and it had a lot of fingerings for a lot of notes, and I went through and I played every single one of those in the book. Some worked for me, some didn't work for me. Then I found some pieces that had some multiphonics in them, but I didn't particularly like the pieces or the way the multiphonics were used until I encountered a piece called Variants by William O. Smith, who was a clarinetist as well as a great composer, great clarinetist, and Bill had written these beautiful multiphonics that were so lyrical, so integral to the musical fabric. So easy to get, relatively speaking, because he knew the clarinet, and so he knew which multiphonics to put together in what combinations, and so he instantly became my hero, and I learned everything I could about him and found as many sources, with his information and his little multiphonics lists, and worked my way through those, and started exploring a whole lot. And the rest is sort of history. And I had always been interested in composing. I did, I wrote tunes for my rock band in high school, and things like that. And actually, when I first started playing piano in third grade, one of the ways our piano teacher helped us learn how to write music, that is, notate music, was that she would ask us to write these little tunes and then bring them in and play them. And then we had to figure out how to notate them, how to write them down. So we just improvised and played these little tunes, and then she helped us write them down. And so that way I learned, how to see my music actually come, to life on a page. And that was really exciting. And so I learned a lot about notation, had a good time composing, and it's always been a thing of mine. And when I got into college, and there really wasn't a lot of music at that time, I started writing a little bit for extended techniques, particularly multiphonics. There weren't a lot of multiphonics pieces, I should say. There were a lot of music, a lot of different kinds of things, but not a lot with multiphonics. Another thing that I discovered fairly early on when I was reading about multiphonics were, at the time, people were saying, well, if you're going to play that modern stuff, you need a different kind of setup than the classical setup. You need a softer reed, you need a more open mouthpiece so that you can, jump around and do all these crazy things. But I didn't like the sound of that change in setup when I was playing more traditional music. So right away, I started thinking about, well, how can I make these things happen and still keep a fairly traditional setup? And in fact, my setup is completely traditional. I play on a old 75-year-old Shedville mouthpiece that it's pretty close facing, probably 107 or something like that by the numbers, and that's on the close side. And a traditional Van Dorn 3.5 plus V12 reed, pretty standard stuff. And I've been playing on that type of setup pretty much for a long time, for 30 years anyway, and probably even more. So that's the background of it. And as I've been exploring multiphonics, and of course, what all multiphonics are really are just expressions of the overtones that are already in the system. They're more overt expressions of how acoustically what's going on in the instrument. So there's nothing really that magic about it. It's just finding ways to freeze halfway in between one register and another, essentially. And it's not as easy as it might seem at first. When we're playing, when we learn individual notes, we start to get comfortable making little adjustments as we go through, changing registers, for example. And we don't realize that we're making these little subtle adjustments, and we get better and better at being more and more subtle with making those adjustments. Hopefully we can get rid of doing much at all with those things. But there are little things that go on, and voicing things. You all know about voicing and dealing with higher register notes and what happens with our tongue position and like that. And the same thing happens when we're working on multiphonics. There are a lot of subtle things that happen. The issue with them is the difference between getting it right and not getting it right in terms of having something come out that you want gets much more narrow when you're working with multiphonics, because you're trying to deal with more than one register simultaneously. But all that's really good, and a lot of it has to do not so much with just trying to power out some notes, but actually getting used to understanding how your relationship with your instrument is, what you do when you encounter changes in resistance in the instrument. We also spend a lot of time with equipment and other things trying to even out the resistance change from note to note. Even so, we've done some things as we move through the instrument and as we change registers, we make these little adjustments. And it's good to know what our tongue does and ways to help train how we deal with that resistance that comes back at us. So before I get into like other exercise things, well, let me shorten this down. Hang on a sec. Okay, there we go. I wanted to, am I able to share a screen here?
You should be able to if you.
Okay. There are two basic exercises that you got copies of. One is the Squeak exercise, and the other is the Surrogate register hole exercise. Well, the Squeak exercise is just good for recognizing tongue position changes that we do from going from one register to the next. So if we were to take an open G, like a normal open G fingering, for example, let me bring that up again. Da, da, da. Okay. All right. Share screen. There we go. Okay. Got it. Okay. So the Squeak exercise, if I take this open G and actually add these other fingers to it, the ring finger and 1, 2 on the right hand and the A flat key, and blow normally with a good full sound, and then just by tongue movement alone squeak to the next note. So what I'm doing is essentially so how about giving that a try?
You want to hear us?
Oh, sure, why not? Very nice. Cool. Okay, hang on a second. I've lost my right picture here. There. Okay, so anyway, okay. I lost my train of thought briefly. Sorry about that as I'm flipping through. The important thing about this particular exercise, doing this, it's fairly easy to get the squeak. It gets harder when you're not moving your head or stopping or changing your air in a radical way, but that you make it really just a tongue only kind of event. So there's going to be motion down here that you might see, but down in the throat area, that's the tongue moving back and forth. But I'm not going to be stopping my air and changing head position or anything like that, or kind of babying the air in any way. So what that is just giving us the sense of a lower voicing and a higher voicing. And then as we go back and forth with those, and you can make as much tongue motion as you want in the early stages of this. And then as you go back and forth, you start making less and less motion difference to get from the low note to the high note. Until you get to a place where you've kind of found the center point between the low note and the high note position for your tongue, and then you can kind of freeze there. So that's one method of kind of honing in on a central pitch. So why not try that a little bit? Just go back and forth and see if you can gradually get to a place where you can get two notes simultaneously. How's that feeling?
How's that feeling?
It's tricky.
Tricky.
Tricky. You can get one and the other note fairly quickly, but getting both at the same time is harder. It's the exercise looks easy. It looks like there's two measures, but it's really like 2 weeks per each measure. So it takes a little while, and it sounds easy when I do it because I've been practicing it for 45 years. So I'm comfortable with it, but it doesn't take a super long time. It's just it increases your awareness of what your tongue is doing. The other exercise that I handed out is this surrogate register hole exercise, which somehow has gotten lost. Let me see if I can find that one. Quarter, multi, easy, multis. Okay, let me find that one. It's quick. Okay, in the surrogate register hole exercise, what happens here is basically whatever the name of the key is that's in this square box is going to be your surrogate register hole. And there's a basic rule that I call the highest open hole rule that says the closer your highest open hole is to whatever your register hole is, the real register hole or some surrogate, the less that register hole, the less well it works as a register vent, and more it wants to work as just a regular fundamental register vent. That's why when I was a beginner, I was climbing up to that high C, and the closer I got to the high C, the more I grunted downward because the register key wasn't working as well. We encounter that a bunch in the fifth partial series as well. C sharp, and we climb up to E maybe, and it's still pretty good. We get to about F natural, it's not so good. The short F sharp is really bad because there's only a tiny bit of difference between the highest open hole right below our middle fingers and the new register hole, which is where our index finger was. So that's just like a couple of inches. And so that's why that F sharp is horrible, even though the hole is a little bit smaller to help make those notes come out better. But the way to make it better, even than that, is to either make the hole even smaller or to put the hole higher up on the instrument. And that's where alternate fingerings come in, and we can talk about that another time. But so this surrogate register hole exercise is just having you open up some key that's not the normal register key, and then it's going to eventually function as a register key as you start climbing down chromatically, because the farther away you go from that register key, the more resistance you'll feel in the instrument, and then at a certain point it's probably going to squeak. And this is going to be a really instructive thing for what your tongue does when it encounters more and more resistance. So basically I'm going to play that top trill key, finger A, then finger A flat, then finger G, then finger G flat, and F, and I just keep going down chromatically. Hopefully at some point I'm going to squeak where it says there on the little exercise sheet. So for me, about to that G flat fingering, I'll get that squeak. Try it for yourselves a little bit and see what you discover. Hey. Um, were there people who, as you kept going down, the squeak didn't happen? Yeah, um, that's super instructive. This is like an isometric exercise because as you're going down lower, that pressure you can feel. There's this back pressure coming back at you from the instrument, and then that is sort of like a invitation to your tongue to do something. It's either going to give in to that pressure and let the pressure win, or it's going to push back. When it pushes back hard enough and holds its ground, you're going to get a squeak. Okay. And if it doesn't, then the tongue needs some strengthening in order to hold its ground. And this is kind of the key for anything upper register, you know, altissimo register in particular, to get good sound, good intonation for those high notes. You're actually trying to maintain a strong semi-forward up position of the tongue. And this exercise really highlights what happens when that back pressure comes in and how our tongue has to engage. So all you have to do is to just push back when you feel that resistance. Just push right back. If you're too tight, or if your voicing is too high, you're probably going to squeak a little bit early than those couple of notes that have the fermatas on them. Okay, that's a little bit pinchy, and I'm getting the squeak right away. If I'm not getting the squeak, then either my voicing is low, or my tongue strength isn't enough to push back, or I'm not actively pushing back to make that squeak. So you can try it again, and if you had difficulties getting it, or if it was too tight, you can make those little adjustments, and hopefully it'll pop out in one of those two places where the fermata is on that one. Why not give it another little blow and see if it comes out better? Good. Airspeed is important too. And this, of course, pressure, you're going to have more air pressure when you have, you know, faster speed. So if you pick up your airspeed and blow strong against that resistance, even without the tongue motion, that's going to be a benefit. And then adding the tongue motion to it is going to help get those notes squeaking if you're not already squeaking. Then once you get the squeak, the next step is to try to hold that position. You're trying to hold this balance between you, the instrument pushing back, and you pushing back, and you're trying to find that middle ground. And it's a very hard thing. It's like driving straight. Remember when you first learned to drive, it's like the driving instructor said, okay, drive straight. And so you're like, oh, this will be easy. And you put your hand on the wheel. Next thing you know, you're like going to the next lane. And then you realize you're having to do this all the time to just drive straight. And we oversteer a lot in the early stages. It's going to be the same kind of thing happening. You know, you just over adjust a lot. I remember doing that for hours and hours when I first started practicing these. Then eventually you get a little bit smoother and you recognize when, you know, when things are going to drift a little bit, and then you lock back in a little bit better. And I think you'll be able to feel how that process goes. And that's also good because you're really fine tuning a kind of optimal position for a given context. And that's what we want to do with all of our playing, of course. So we want to have that sort of optimal position. want to know how a high D feels so that you can play it really soft, you know, when you need it in the middle of the second movement of the Brahms trio, and things like that. And so those things are really important. So those two basic exercises are good ones just for gaining a sense of our relationship of our tongue to the different registers and to different resistances that we encounter. Because when we start using multiphonics, not only are we going to be playing multiphonics from traditional fingerings, but we're going to use surrogate register holes and all kinds of other fingering combinations. So there's going to be a huge variety of resistances that we're going to have to deal with when we play. And pretty much the next step is to, when we encounter multiphonics, is just to know what kind of multiphonic we're encountering. And that's where this multiphonics overview page I have is. And I'm just going to bring that up quickly. Some of these basic things we know already. There's the highest open hole rule, 1D. That's really important for just understanding how the clarinet works in every context. And so the register vent wants to act as a regular vent the closer our highest open hole gets to it. So in other words, if I'm playing a high C, it's a kind of a nice balance on the instrument between that feeling of the register key wanting to be do its job correctly and create the C, or that it wants to grunt and create essentially an open G. So the high C is kind of a nice note to experiment on, because we can get that one pretty well. It's a nice balanced one, and we can get that grunt. I had that even during my doctorate. Stanley Hasty really scolded me for the grunt, and most of us can get that fairly well. So why not give that a try? You're playing this high C and just grunting it a little bit. Cool. Yep, sounds good. If you're having trouble getting the grunt, start with the grunt. Start with too loose of an embouchure and not enough air, so that the reed really won't be, you're pretty sure the reed won't be vibrating fast enough to get up there, and then gradually increase your air and firmness of your embouchure until that starts to pop out. That's the first step in this little exercise. Then the second step is, once you've gotten that high C, you can start working down chromatically to really feel what's going to happen with this highest open hole. So as I'm taking the high C and going down, that was down to G, and that's probably about as far as we need to go under most circumstances as far as voicing for any traditional context. What's happening there is, of course, the lower I go, the better the register key works, which means the low note in a multiphonic is not going to show up as easily. So that means I have to voice lower. And you should try this for yourselves. Start that high C and then work down slowly chromatically. See if you can freeze both of those notes, the upper register and the grunt note, as you go down, and feel what happens for you to be able to maintain that lower note as you go down the chromatic scale. Well, let's hear it. Oh, yeah. That's great. That's great. Is there somebody who can describe what that feeling is like as you're going lower? How do you keep both notes? What's going on?
Anyone? We're unmuted.
What do you feel?
You have to like constantly adjust your embouchure and like your tongue position.
Yeah, in what way? What does it feel like? Like there's this ball of air that's kind of like the resistance thing, and what happens to that ball of air as you go lower?
You gotta kind of keep pushing at it.
Yeah, where do you feel it going in order to maintain both of those notes? Is it going more forward towards the reed or back down your throat?
Back down my throat, I guess I would say.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. That's right. That's exactly right. So that's already showing you how you can make adjustments in your pushback against the resistance of the instrument to, in this case, since we're focusing on the lower note from a high note context, we're actually darkening the sound or dulling the sound out a little bit. I can think of the great sotto voce section in the first movement of the second Brahms sonata. And sotto voce we know means kind of like half voiced or kind of this stage whisper thing. So it's less appropriate to play it the way you might play the very beginning of it in terms of your voicing and just your focus. Okay, that's not so much sotto voce. It sounds okay, but it's not really sotto voce. And what I've discovered in comparing the multiphonics with that little moment is we may do that intuitively for the sotto voce section, but we can actually quantify it a little bit. If we start that high C and I let that ball of air kind of move its way down my throat and get to that sort of husky sound down in there, and then go immediately into the Brahms, that's the feeling. Then you get really soft and covered and delicate with the sound, and that's with a voicing that's kind of down deep in there like that. And that's just an example of how the highest open hole, as it changes, its position changes. When we have to try to find a multiphonic, we have to do some things. We have to find a slightly different voicing position for those notes. And the overview, I wonder why I always lose it. Hang on a sec. Okay. Back to the overview here. This I've divided the different multiphonics into basically 4 categories, and it's essentially really just 2 categories with a kind of weird third category. But you're either going to be overblowing lower notes or underblowing higher partial notes. Okay, and then there's this category 4, which is a combination of upper fundamental notes and lower third partial fingerings, which is kind of an interesting one. But the first category, you can overblow your fundamental, and you get really wide distance between the primary tones. So you get not only those tones, but you get a lot of difference tones, summation tones, a lot of stuff in the mix of those. So if you're trying to overblow a fundamental note, very often you're going to get a very rich and complex sound, not only just because of the 2 primary tones that you might be playing, but all of these difference tones that are in the audible spectrum. you know, like that, that kind of sound, which is a fun sound to get. And then it's a little bit the opposite, um, underblowing the upper partial notes. You are focusing on the upper partial, but you're very subtly pulling back your either dropping your voicing just a tiny bit or reducing your air pressure just a tiny bit to allow that lower note to come in just a little. Ultimately, as we do these things, we want to change from normal as little as possible. Just like when we started at the very beginning, when we went from A, the throat tone A, to long B natural. Do you remember that the first year you played? Oh man, it was like those short notes were really easy. All those left-handed notes, and then all of a sudden you had to cover all those notes, and it felt like you were, you know, blowing into a little cocktail straw suddenly instead of a nice, comfortable clarinet. And it's going to feel sort of like that. There's going to be a really radical difference in from what you're used to, but you get used to it fairly quickly if you just do it regularly, like anything. And so it doesn't take too long. The category 2 is exactly upper partial fingerings with the normal fingerings. Category 3 uses the surrogate register vents instead of the traditional register vents, and so you're going to get just different combinations of pitches based on a particular, you know, fundamental fingering, and so that's not so hard. Then not so different even than category 2. And then category 4, finally, these upper fundamental and lower third partial things are really interesting. If you take like a long C, the clarion C, and you add the A key to it, that's one of the easiest ones. It's a well-balanced one between wanting to be a low note and wanting to be a high note. But the clarinet, when you play C, it's like all there for you, and it plays C just nice. And then when you add the A key, the clarinet has a decision to make. It can't quite decide what you're doing. The clarinet says, well, she's, you know, I think she's playing a C, but there's this other thing open. Now what am I going to do about that? This other hole is pretty close to the register hole, and so it's easy for the register hole to win. And opening the A key doesn't really do anything. But it's just far enough away from the regular register key so that the clarinet gets a little bit grumpy and says, well, you know, maybe she really wants to play the low note instead of the upper note. So let's try that. And so it kind of does this little bouncy thing back and forth. And it's a really easy one to try, and it sounds cool when you get it. It's kind of this nice, quiet, distant train sound. You want to do that one? Long C with the A key. That's great. Sounds like a train yard of trains coming through. That's cool. I like the sounds of those. Um, so that's a sample of the fourth category of multiphonics. Down at the bottom of this page of microtone overview, I have a list of sources for fingerings and things like that. A particularly great source in my mind is Gregory Oakes's website, and because he has a whole bunch of multiphonics with sound files, the fingerings, the sound files, he plays them, you can hear them, you can see them, you can learn about a lot of the acoustic principles at work. So that's a really great website to go to, and you can try out a lot of those fingerings and compare your sound with his. It's easy to suddenly discover that intonation is a big issue. We can play these notes with a lot of intonation changes, a lot of difference in intonation, just like we can any regular note. And because we're trying to make all these other adjustments, sometimes when the adjustments aren't so subtle, the intonation can be way off. And so we have to work to get our configuration, mouth configuration, and tongue position, and air pressure configuration as close to our normal playing as possible. Then the pitches kind of perk up and they get better in tune. High notes, of course, are much more flexible in intonation, and so that means that the high notes are going to be more variable in pitch. And so we want to, in general, when we're playing multiphonics, we want to voice toward the high note, so that one will be better in tune. That's not universal. This last one that you just did, you can't really voice to the high note because you'll lose the low one for sure. So there's kind of a quick overview of what's going on in the instrument. I've also included another little sheet that's called Easy Multiphonics, and you want to take a look at this sheet. And the thing about it is that it should be relatively easy to read this. All you're wanting to do is start where the asterisks are in the middle of any given line. The upper staff is the regular normal fingering. In this case, fifth partial notes. You can see that asterisk is a normal C sharp fingering, and the next one to it is a very normal D fingering. And those are actually quite easy notes to underblow a little bit and to get that low multiphonic. As I move either to the left or to the right, I'm going to have to adjust a little bit, either to lower my focus as I go left, because I'm adding more fingers away from that highest, my highest open hole is getting farther away from the register hole. Or when I move to the right, I'm going to have to think a little bit higher in my voicing because my highest open hole is getting closer and closer to the register hole, and the register hole isn't doing its job as well. So I'm going to have to focus up. So that's the top line of that first system is with the register key. The second line is without the register key. Then the whole big second system is a little bit tougher than the first system because we have a different surrogate register key. We have not only the regular register key, but we have the thumb hole in the back. And the ones, again, in the middle are the easiest, and then you work yourself outward and change your focus that way. On the second page, same thing. Now we're using our middle finger of our left hands as the fifth partial activator rather than the top hole on the index finger hole. We're using the middle finger hole, which is definitely tougher because it's a bigger hole and it's lower. So that the asterisks are the easier ones, and moving outward from those is more difficult. And then finally, I've added the ring finger as our second register hole for a fifth partial note, and there are only a couple there that are kind of valuable for doing. And then down at the very bottom of that second page is what you already did, the easy multiphonics category 2 from third partial fingerings. And about where the arrow goes is about where they're easy. Beyond that, they are really hard. But you can expand to get to where the arrows finish on most of these without a whole lot of trouble. And so it's kind of a nice starting place where the instrument is kind of balanced well between this low and high, and then you can move just a little bit lower, just a little bit higher without so much radical shifting all at once. Just as they didn't give us wide intervals like from open G to high B flat like from the Brahms Second Sonata. We didn't get that in fourth grade. And there were reasons for it. We just weren't ready for it chop wise. So sometimes it is valuable to build your chops through these sort of basics and feel how those changes are occurring. The good news is it's much easier for us to do it now than we could have done it, in fourth or fifth grade, because, we've got 8, 10, 12 years, how much ever, of experience playing, and our chops are strong, and we have some good sense about how the instrument's going to function. And this is just taking all those subtle things that are in the instrument already and just bringing them out and hearing them and kind of exploring them, scrutinizing them. It's like taking looking at something that seems kind of cool and then putting it under a magnifying glass or a microscope and then saying, wow, there's all these other layers. And then you can really fine tune your playing. And there are some wonderful things that come out of that. One is for traditional playing. One for sure is our understanding of how resonance fingerings for throat tones work. We just play an open G, and we need to resonate that one, or an A flat, or especially like A. But why, and what's happening with resonance fingerings? What's happening is, as the instrument gets shorter and shorter, the distance between the fundamental and the overtones is also getting smaller and smaller. So whereas if I'm overblowing a low C and just squeaking it, I can get a pretty good G. With or without the register key, it's pretty much a G. As I get higher on the instrument, that's not the case. If I'm overblowing that open G, I should be getting a D, but I don't. Right? The D's already really flat, and it's worse for A flat and A. They get even flatter. And so what happens when we add resonance fingerings is not only are we adjusting the pitch downward tiny bit of the fundamental note, but what we're doing is we're actually affecting the overtone in a pretty radical way. And you can test this out yourself by playing the open G, squeaking it, and then just randomly wiggling fingers, because you'll get it's crazy, right? There's like all these different sounds in there and all these different pitches. Ultimately, we generally settle on a fingering collection that seems to give us the best so-called resonance fingering. And what's happening is now our third partial D is actually more well in tune with the G. It's partly why the G perks up, because the instrument's now more well in tune with itself. So you can hear that the D is in that mix, and the G sounds good because the D is in tune with the mix. And so I just pushed the upper note of that a little bit and sort of sneaked out. Same thing with A flat and A from whatever traditional resonance fingerings. And you can kind of experiment and find your own resonance fingerings that allow the lower note to still speak really well and not be too resistant, and tune up that third partial note so that the instrument's playing better in tune with itself. That's a really good feature. And a great thing to learn. Also, we're learning about these colors in again less. The intuitive way is great, but when intuition takes a little vacation, it's really nice to have some knowledge and some kind of empirical ways of getting at a solution, because sometimes our intuition works, sometimes it's taking a little break and we need some help. So that's one of the great things that Multiphonics does. It helps us recognize this relationship between us and our instrument, and how we can push the instrument to sound brighter, or how we can relax to sound mellower, softer, and it's that constant pushing of those things. Are there any questions?
I have a few if nobody has any. I'll give everybody a chance at home to write theirs before I ask. Or maybe I'll ask if they're writing. I'm going to ask a little bit of a loaded question. Aside from learning to control color and voicing, what can practicing multiphonics do for relieving tension in playing, particularly in the neck and throat?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah. What it does, I think, is because the instrument's just not it's not going to let us get away with things when we're doing things like especially when we're doing multiphonics. It's not going to let us get away with mistakes kind of playing. It's not going to let us get away with biting or being too loose in an embouchure or too one way or another. And same with tension. And so as we're playing these things, it helps us find this sort of balance place where we can be relaxed. There's almost no change from the regular playing and the multiphonics playing when I'm there. I fine-tune my position so that I don't have to use external things to help me. And the other thing is that it's mostly an internal activity. Multiphonics, it's a lot about air, speed, and pressure, and a lot about the internal part of your embouchure, i.e., the tongue position. So those external things, they just don't factor in. And most of the playing that we do, certainly in the initial stages with multiphonics, is very slow and very long tony kind of thing. That helps with the relaxation a lot as well. So that's a really good question. And ultimately, when we do find that center spot and that sweet spot, it has, we've really fine tuned it. And that also allows us to just be more relaxed and comfortable when we've found that spot, kind of worn away, peeled back down to the essence of where that best position is for us from all of those other kind of semi-close positions.
So I have more. I always have more questions. Just our school prides itself as being very composition centric. All of our students, no matter what their degree program, take composition here. Do you have any advice for how a new composer might approach utilizing these extended techniques if they've never composed with them before? Do you have any general advice for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, where I went with this initially, and this was mostly for microtonal fingerings at first, and then multiphonics a little bit later, was I just had regular notes, and I used the microtones as kind of colorations, ornaments, decorations of the regular notes. So that might be as good a way to start as any. And you like add a little noodle on it, and to help decorate a particularly high point in your musical line, and then just to write the line normally, and then sprinkle in a little spice in some places and see what it sounds like. That was one way that I did it a lot early on, and that felt comfortable to me. Kind of the same with multiphonics. I usually would start with a regular note and then either relax my pressure and let the low one grow out of that, or push a little bit on the lower note and let that upper one come out from there. So building that way, from just normal notes is also kind of handy and not too difficult to do. And I would say even now there's a lot of times that I will do that in my own compositions, write a bunch of regular notes and then say, okay, these regular notes sound good. I'm going to spice them up just a little bit, or some of them up a little bit, to not make it sound like a major triad. To tweak it just a little bit.
Good. Thank you. Oh, sorry, we have some more questions in the chat if you
Oh
have
yeah,
time.
a bunch of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have first time this was explained well that I could get a good understanding and start hearing multiple notes. Is there a source of chamber music using extended techniques? My woodwind quintet is especially interested.
Oh man, um, there are some. There's a classic, really crazy hard one. The Yorgi Ligeti 10 pieces. It's super hard because everybody has to play awkward instruments, doubles, and but that's a pretty good one. And there is no with trying to think of there are a number of other sources. A lot of chamber music by composers who are part of the uh, spectral scene, like Grisey. Uh, you can find several chamber things from people like that, or Kurtag, um, European composers, and yeah, there's a kind of an odd thing, and you may find this if you're playing multiphonics with somebody else. This was kind of amazing. The first time I met Bill Smith and went to his house, and we said, "Oh, let's improvise together, like do these multiphonic chorales together." That was great. So we sat in his dining room and did that, and we played. And you find when there's all this complex sound going on in close proximity, um, and the same type of instruments, they actually oftentimes will fight with each other. The sounds will, and both of us had moments when multiphonics that we had been playing, for years and should have not had any issues with, would just collapse and fall because of the acoustics of the other sounds in the air. So multiphonics in particular are a little grumpier when you're playing in larger group contexts. And so that's an interesting thing in chamber music. Microtones, not so much. I mean, I've played a bunch of microtone pieces for, mixed chamber groups. Not so much with woodwind quintet, but a number with string groups and other mixed chamber groups. And that works fine because you're counting on generally like different fingerings, and you're not making these little subtle other adjustments in air and embouchure. And so microtonal music does work pretty well that way. There's a question here, nice question, about the production of multiphonics with different clarinet brands. I've really worked hard on trying to follow acoustic principles rather than idiosyncrasies of a particular brand or another. And by and large, they work on all of the instruments that are, this configuration of BAME system. The one exception is the Selmer instruments, that the signature instruments that had the shorter barrel for a while, and because they were redesigned just a little bit right there in the top part of the instrument. And so what it meant was that the top trill key, the top couple of trill keys, didn't give you the same third partial that we can get these other ones. A little bit low. It was fixable, but it took more work. By and large, though, these fingerings generally work because the instruments are generally the same acoustically. There are minimal differences from one to the other in them. So as long as it's this system, the Multiphonics and other extended techniques tend to work. Of course, if you were using an old Albert system or a German system clarinet, there's a whole new set of issues. And I haven't dealt with those instruments. So, but with this system, it's pretty universal, I think.
We had another question come in.
Yeah. Let's see. Getting the notes out. Yeah, improvise with them or just use them more freely. That's so great. It's it's one of the things I do the most is improvise. And when we find a position for a note, we learn it. We get that muscle memory. And this is true for any note that we play. I mean, you get that high D out there, you know where it is and how it's going to sound, how it's going to feel in your mouth. And ultimately, you find that to be the case with certain multiphonics. I would say, these basic category 2 multiphonics where you're underblowing a fifth partial note are pretty easy ones to improvise in right away in any context. And you just kind of go to one of those notes and it feels relatively comfortable pretty quickly. So I would say practice with those category 2 and 3 fifth partial notes that are on the easy multiphonics sheet, and then just start incorporating them into improvisations to see if that muscle memory is so strong that you can pop it out from different contexts, different, starting places. And if so, then you've gotten to that point where the muscle memory is really strong. And it may take a while, but it may not, because again, all of you have had good experience exploring things, playing wrong notes and trying to play them again. That's a great instructor for all of us, is to replicate our mistakes, to find out what in the heck we were doing, and so that feels good. Do that a lot, because you'll recognize where you don't want to be and how that's different from where you do want to be, and then you've got 2 worlds available to you if you want to go that other direction. There's a question about bass clarinet. Way different. Some things are the same. Some of the basic, the basic overtone series is the same, but the holes have such different sizes, which means they have such different ways of operating. That surrogate register hole concept is really kind of out the window on bass clarinet, because instead of a hole being only, like a quarter or eighth of an inch in diameter, now on the bass clarinet, they're a couple of inches in diameter, and you really can't get the same kind of splitting of the registers with those surrogate register holes that are that huge on the bass clarinet. So it becomes a completely different monster. There are great fingering resources for extended techniques on bass clarinets, and they do vary by model quite a bit. Selmer and Buffet. Sarah Watts has a great book on bass clarinet multiphonics. She uses the Buffets, and it's as complete as it gets. That's a fantastic book, the best one. Hari Sparnai was also obviously a great bass clarinetist, the master, the champion, father of solo bass clarinet. And his book deals with the Buffet types of models, and Henri Bock his book deals with the Selmer type of models. So, and you'll find that there are different pitches for the different fingerings. And in fact, you'll find in some of these other websites or other sources that you look at, you'll find some different intonations for just regular clarinet things. And what I discovered from having gone through the Bartolozzi book were a lot of those differences had to do with making such radical adjustments in the embouchure, internal and external, and air pressure, that it actually was affecting, the true intonation, acoustic intonation of a lot of notes that are notated in that book. I could get them, but I had to do like really weird non-clarinet-y things. And some of the fingerings in some of those sources that you'll find are achieved by doing really radical things. So the pitches are not entirely accurate. That's partly why I like Greg Oakes's book, because you can hear them, you can see them, and you can replicate them for yourself, and the pitches are good.
Mila, I think they're at the bottom of the
Oh yeah,
clarinet multiphonics, an overview.
yes, you're right. That's a good place to find some of those things. That's true.
Any other questions? Oh, well, thank you. That was incredible. It was so much fun. I hope that we didn't blow anybody's ears out by trying some
It
stuff
sounds so
here.
great.
um, so I hope all of you, if we did, that you have ibuprofen and can lay down now. But thank you so much for coming. This was really informative, and we're excited to try this stuff out and incorporate it into our practice.
Awesome. Good. Yeah, and you have my email address there. Everybody does in those handouts. And if you have any questions ever, or comments or discoveries, I'm all about hearing about them, because I'd love to hear what you find out.
Well, thank you again. It was so nice to see you, and I hope you enjoy the wonderful weather.
Thank you so much. It's so great to see you too, and good to meet you all, and great to hear those wonderful sounds.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Bye bye.